Yeah, yeah. Just share it. I gave you the permission. Yeah.
Okay. So then that is my thing. So, okay. So, so I now start my talk. Inductive Metaphysics and its Abductive Methodology. This is the title of my talk. And let me start. So if you don't, do you understand me, right? Yes. So if you don't understand me well, please tell me. According to the dominant tradition, metaphysics is considered as a conceptual a priori discipline, as we know. But there is an alternative a posteriori conception of metaphysics with informal roots that can also be found in Aristotle, and it is called inductive metaphysics. Now, the term inductive metaphysics was coined by philosophical developments in the late 19th and the early 20th century, with philosophers like Wilhelm Wundt, Oswald Külpe, or Erich Becher. Here's a general characterization of inductive metaphysics. Inductive metaphysics is here often abbreviated as IM. It aims at an a posteriori justification of metaphysical claims based on ampliative inferences. Ampliative means content expanding. Inductive, and in particular, abductive inferences from given empirical data. And IM is embedded in a methodology that closely resembles that of science. That is the general characterization. And if you have questions of understanding, you may also interrupt me. Okay. So do you see the full screen here?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Okay. Good. So the relation. What is the relation to conceptual a priori metaphysics? Well, a priori methods such as conceptual analysis or concept explication are still considered as an indispensable part of metaphysics. I mean, for instance, if you work in the metaphysics of freedom, the first and foremost thing is to give an explication of the concept of freedom. What should it mean? I mean, what does it mean and what should it mean? What inductive metaphysics merely claims is that the justification of many important metaphysical beliefs cannot proceed in a purely a priori manner, but needs empirical premises and abductive inferences. Okay. And what is the relation to naturalized metaphysics? This is an older time in contemporary philosophy, right? So goes back in part to Quine. And the point is, naturalized metaphysics derives its thesis more directly from science, right? So to speak, science does the abduction, and philosophy just draws consequences. And some philosophers of this camp also reject abduction as a metaphysical method, for instance, Ladyman. In contrast, inductive metaphysics applies the abductive methodology explicitly, right? And it applies it to empirical sources of different kinds, including empirical facts established by science, of course, but also facts about successful versus unsuccessful scientific practice, for instance, and also everyday experience. Okay. Via abductions, so central to inductive metaphysics. Now, in inductive metaphysics, you know, this term coming from the 19th century, the notion of induction is understood in a very wide sense, meaning all kinds of non-deductive, uncertain, or ampliative inferences. So in this wide sense, this is important for inductive metaphysics because it includes abduction or inference to the best explanation, right? So even today, several philosophers understand when they speak about induction, they understand this term in this wide sense, as uncertain inferences of all sorts. In contrast, the narrow or human sense, you know, David Hume, human sense of induction, here induction is just a projection of observed regularities to unobserved or future cases, right? So the point is with human induction in the narrow sense, one cannot introduce new concepts into the conclusion. And so one cannot transcend the range of what is observable. Right? So you just give a statement from some observed individuals to other unobserved individuals, but you cannot introduce new concepts. But metaphysical concepts and principles speak about the unobservable. In this respect, they're similar to so-called theoretical concepts in science and principles, theoretical principles in science. So it was indeed an important insight of post-positivist philosophy of science that theoretical concepts such as force, for instance, in physics, cannot be semantically reduced to observable concepts. As you find this in Carnap, Hampersneed, French, Mayberg, and others. So the conclusion is abductions are needed whenever one reasons from observed phenomena to theoretical concepts, because abductions are the only kind of inference that can introduce new concepts relevantly into the conclusion. So that is a major point of mine. I prefer not to speak of induction in the wide sense, but of induction in the narrow sense, and on the other side of abduction. But I mean, other philosophers just mean with induction both of them. But the point is, the really important things, inferences, are abductions. Okay. Now, if I compare theoretical concepts in science and metaphysics, the following can be said. Theoretical concepts in science describe unobservable entities, for instance, electrons, or unobservable relations, for instance, forces, right? Gravitational force, that explain the observed phenomena in a unified way. Concepts of inductive metaphysics or metaphysics in general are similar to theoretical concepts in science, as they go beyond the observable to offer unified explanations of the observable. Of course, we should now ask what distinguishes metaphysical concepts from theoretical concepts in science. What distinguishes it is their more general and transdisciplinary nature, the more general and in a particular transdisciplinary nature of metaphysical concepts as opposed to scientific theoretical concepts. So, for instance, while the notion of force belongs to physics, the more general notion of the cause, right, belongs to metaphysics. I mean, these notions are somehow parallel, right? But cause is transdisciplinary in an obvious sense. And while the notion of a conservation law is a typical notion of physics, the notion of a law of nature in general belongs to inductive metaphysics. Okay. Therefore, not only theoretical science, but also inductive metaphysics needs abduction. A bit more in abduction now. First, abduction in the writings of the late Charles Sanders Peirce is roughly the same as Haman's notion of inference to the best explanation. Now, this is a thesis. of mine and of several other people. Not all people agree with that, but really, if you read first, you see that in the late writings, this abduction, he means not only the inference to an explanation of the surprising phenomenon, but an inference to an explanation which is as good as plausible as possible, right? Which is really better than other possible explanations. So it's a kind of inference to the best explanation, and it follows I use a notion of abduction and inference to the best explanation synonymously. Okay. Second, we must be clear that the abducted conclusion, that is the explanation, the explanatory hypothesis, is of course highly uncertain and has to be confirmed by further tests. Yeah. Okay. The general pattern of abduction is usually presented as follows. There is a surprising fact, which in our domain here is usually a general empirical fact, irregularity. And there is a given background knowledge which we need, and we try to find an explanatory hypothesis. And if this is the best among all considered or conceivable alternatives, then we for the time being, infer that this hypothesis is probably true or something. That is it. And the background knowledge, of course, drives in the way the inference from the surprising fact and the explanatory hypothesis. But how this exactly works, this inference, really depends on the kind of abduction you're speaking about. I wrote a paper in 2008 entitled Patterns of Abduction, where I really distinguished several different kinds of abduction, each having a different pattern, so to speak. But for our purpose here, it's sufficient to consider two large families, major families of abduction, namely selective and creative abductions. And this distinction goes back, I mean, already Magnani has it in a work 2001. You find it in my work, you find it in Niloto, and so on. So, selective abductions, they are abductions of particular facts. They search for explanations of particular empirical facts by known laws or theories. The emphasis is here on known. So, for instance, you see a footprint in the sand and look for an explanation of this footprint. Someone was walking here. Who was walking here? Well, you see, there is usually a multitude of possible causes of this observed surprising fact, following from which you can infer retrospectively with help of all of your known laws, right? And there are well-known search strategies for this selective abduction in the literature, like, yeah. But the other thing are creative abduction, which in my recent book, which appeared with Oxford University Press, I called them theory-generating abduction. So they search for explanations of empirical facts, usually general empirical facts, and these empirical facts are empirical regularities or also dispositions, as you will see, by new theories about unobservable causes. So these abductions create new theoretical concepts and laws that create them. So for instance, the explanation of the trajectories of planets by the gravitational force of the sun is such an abduction, which was done by Newton, right? Because, I mean, the notion of force is by no means contained in the explanandum or in the premises of the abduction, namely the description of the trajectories of the planets, of the observation of their positions in the dark, in the sky, and so on, right? The notion of force is just a creative postulation of a hidden entity. And they are rarely studied by abductivists, but they are needed for science and for the metaphysics. And in the rest of this talk, I focus on these creative or theory-generating abductions. And the point is, the major challenge of a theory of these creative abductions are, how can you eliminate purely speculative abduction? Because it is well known that for every given set of facts, you can create or abductively infer in colons a perfect post factum explanation. The emphasis being on post factum, after the facts, by stipulating sufficiently many theoretical or hidden variables. So often theoretical variables are also called hidden variables, so you don't observe them. Example, post facto explanation of arbitrary facts by God's wishes, or alternatively by intricate conspiracy theories, like last week the Dow Jones index went up, abductive conjecture, God made this to support Trump. First note that if you really want to explain post factum, all facts, whatever they will be, in this way, then for every observed fact, a new wish of God has to be postulated post factum. It's a kind of metaphysical duplication. And the thesis is speculative abductions of this sort are without scientific and without epistemic value, because first, they do not provide unification in the sense that a set of elementary facts is reduced to a smaller set of elementary principles. So then this idea of unification goes, for instance, back to Michael Friedman, and this is exactly what my paper with Karl Lambert in 1994 was about, this theory, this notion of unification. So this is the first thing, because for every fact, one corresponding wish in this case has to be positive. And second, these speculative abductions are of course not potentially predictive because they are post factum. You can give them only after you have already observed the fact which you explain. Therefore, they are not independently testable by so-called used novel evidence. And this is very important. Independent test, so used novel evidence means an evidence that was not used in order to create or construct the theory or theoretical hypothesis. And since theoretical hypotheses have variable parameters, theoretical parameters, they can be, if you have already the facts which you want to explain, you can fit this hypothesis however you want to any facts you want. For instance, the theoretical parameter of your God explanation is God's wishes. You don't know what God's wishes are, but you can fit them to whatever you have observed. Therefore, speculative abduction can also not be independently tested because they are not potentially predicted. Another examples are post facto explanations of empirical dispositions by special powers, like the example of Molière. Opium has a disposition to make people sleepy, therefore, this is because opium has a special power. It was called a virtus dormitiva, by which it makes people sleepy. I mean, again, we have just a metaphysical duplication here of the given empirical dispositions without any further insight. It's post facto. And again, there's no unification here, and there's no independent testability here. Because for every temporal regularity, you can just postulate a special power, whatever these temporal regularities are which you are going to observe. So the conclusion is now, we have two demarcation criteria between speculative and scientific abduction. First, unification, and second, independent testability, or which is equivalent, potential predictiveness. Now, scientific abductions possess these two virtues to a high degree. And most scientific abductions proceed as follows. They infer from a set of intercorrelated empirical dispositions or regularities a common underlying theoretical property or a common cause. Where I will speak later a bit about the question, what is the cause, right? But okay, so scientific abduction, I say that they typically infer from a set of intercorrelated dispositions a common cause. And no, with the disposition here and understood exactly a law-like temporal regularity. So whenever a certain trigger condition obtains, a certain reaction follows for a given object. So this is the standard account of dispositions as temporal regularities and not more. This is not the view of dispositional essentialism, but here I insist on distinguishing between dispositional properties and categorical properties, which are usually called that they are causal basis, right? Molecular structures are not dispositions, but they are the basis of dispositions, right? This is the view here. I think this is a good view, the right view. Okay. Now, common cause abductions in science. Here's an example. My first study was indeed chemistry, so I give an example from chemistry. Solubility in water. So there are certain substances that are, for instance, soluble in water. Sugar, salt, natrium carbonate, copper sulfate, and all kinds. But other chemical substances are not soluble in water at all, right? Okay. So why is that? Now, these substances have this disposition of solubility in common, but the point is when the substances which are soluble in water, all of them have several other dispositions altogether. If a substance has one of these dispositions, it has all of them. So, for instance, soluble in water means is the following regularity. If you put the substance in water, E1x, then it will dissolve R1. But the same system will then not be soluble in oil. If you give it in oil, it won't dissolve. It will be soluble in all so-called water-similar solvents, like ammonium and whatever. If you put them in such solvents, it will dissolve. It won't be soluble in oil-similar solvents like benzene or whatever. If you put it in these liquids, it won't dissolve. It will have an increased melting point compared to other substances, which are not soluble. And it will, if you solve it, the solution will conduct electricity, and you may even give other dispositions. So, already in the 7th and 18th century, chemists in that phase conjectured, well, this must have a reason that all these substances, these particular substances have all these dispositions in common. They must have a common cause, which is somehow in these substances and not in the others. So this common theoretical property or nature was called the hydrophilic nature of this substance. So this is a creative abduction, a common cause abduction. And then there was a research program. What is this? The essence of this nature, and given the atomic and molecular hypothesis in the 19th century, the theoretical model was quickly developed. It was a model of an electric dipole, so the molecule bondings have an electrically polarized structure, and since all water similar solvents have also polarized structure, these substances dissolve. So this is a typical example. Okay. Abduction of chemical kinds. And you can show that abduction in other domains have proceeded in a similar way, like the abduction of force in classical physics from diverse trajectories of bodies. It's a very similar structure. So these trajectories are also empirical regularities or dispositions, right? Or the abduction of common ancestor from similar species in evolutionary biology, right, has a similar structure. Okay. And such a common cause abduction yields unification because given you have m substances and n correlated dispositions, then you can infer from each substance to each dispositions you have m times n empirical laws, and they are then unified by m plus n theoretical laws, right? And m times n is much larger than m plus n, so it's a strong unification here. You can explain empirical laws by a few theoretical laws. Okay, and also these common cause abductions entail novel predictions by which they are independently testable, because if a substance, for instance, in our example, is soluble in water, this indicates then that it is hydrophilic, so it has the theoretical property of being hydrophilic. And therefore, for instance, you can predict it will not be soluble in oil. You can predict that before you, if it is a new substance, ever put it in oil. Just from its behavior in water, you can predict its behavior in oil. Like that is a really novel prediction in the best sense. Okay. Good. So far about abduction in theory, creative abductions or theory-generating abductions in science. Now, I come to the second part of the talk, the major challenge for inductive metaphysics. Are metaphysical abductions similar to these scientific abductions? Do they also possess the two virtues of unification and independent stability? Now, some philosophers have rejected the transfer of abduction from natural sciences to metaphysics, like Ladyman, Sarzi, Helen Beebe, Juha Sarzi, and so on. And there's still a controversy going on here. Other philosophers have advocated this transfer, like already Armstrong or Paul or Williamson in some more recent papers. My colleague Neil Lotto, myself in my writings. Yeah, so you may divide this in two questions. Do metaphysical abductions at least possess the virtue of unification? And here the answer is usually yes. Yeah. Causality, law of nature, what are essences, natural kinds, whatever metaphysical notions you look at, they of course attempt to unify a lot of observable phenomena and also phenomena known from science and from common sense. So this is clear. But is this first virtue enough? This is controversial. And I think in general, no. I mean, do metaphysical abductions possess also the second virtue of independent stability or potential predictivity? Well, this is controversial, or this is depends. Not always, but at least sometimes, right? I say that metaphysical principles of inductive metaphysics may even be potentially predictive. So they may be confirmed not only by post-factum unification properties, yeah, but also by independent tests, so to speak. And in the remainder of the talk, I will give you two examples. Now, there is also something, a slide here where I show that independent stability is stronger than unification. So it entails unification, but in the other direction, unification is weaker than independent stability. But I skip this slide now. We can talk about the relation between independent stability and maybe later. In any case, keep in mind that the independent stability is stronger than unification, but it entails it, because independent stability always means that there must be several pieces of evidence, one by which you fit the construct the hypothesis, and the other by which you test it independently, right? So that is, roughly speaking, the reason why independent stability always entails unification, but not the other way around. Okay. So my first example is the justification of perceptual realism by a common cause abduction. So the thesis is that this justification works in the same way as abduction in science, although unconsciously, like in ordinary people, of course, perceptual realism works unconsciously. So unconsciously, we automatically see a three-dimensional world. And epistemologists like Moser and Vogel have pointed out that, and also Neil Lotto and others. Okay. Here's the point. So what we immediately see are visual two-dimensional perceptions of given objects from different positions. So what we see are perspectival objects. So prima facie two-dimensionally. But there are strict correlations between these two-dimensional perceptions of given objects from different positions, right? And so these internal perceptions are dispositions of the following forms. If I look from this viewpoint, I have this and this visual impression. These visual impressions are mutually correlated. And these visual dispositions are also intercorrelated with tactile perception. And the best explanation of that is the explanation by a three-dimensional object in a three-dimensional space that causes the position-dependent two-dimensional images by the laws of perspectival projection of light rays. Right, that is a thesis. So that is the abduction. And this is, of course, predictively extremely powerful. So, I mean, how powerful the visual system of our brain is has been pointed out by many cognitive psychologists like Clark. And it achieves powerful unification. Unifies all of our perceptions, right? Perceptual experience, visual experiences is already Kant emphasized so often. So here's a picture. You see here a three-dimensional object. You see here a box. You see here my position. If I observe it on the same plane, so horizontally, then the visual perception is this. Is observe it a bit from the top and from a top but in a straight line, the visual perception is this. If you observe it from the top but from an angle, the visual perception is this. If I top it from the bottom and an angle, the visual perception is this, and so on and so on. And one perception is enough. Like, I mean, this not necessarily, but this is already enough to predict that if I go there, I will have this impression. If I go there, I will have this impression, and so on. I can predict all these things at once. Why? Because immediately abduct the existence of a three-dimensional object, this one, from which I can predict how it would look like from other angles of view. Okay. So this is obvious that this is an extremely powerful and unificatory and predictive abduction, perceptual realism. The next question is perceptual realism really the best explanation of our sense experience? Well, you know, there's this famous or infamous alternative brain in the vat explanation, you know. So you see it here. This is the ordinary explanation of visual perception. You see a fountain tree. This is projected by light rays on your retina. This is a brain in a vat explanation. There is a supercomputer on which you are swimming in a vat, right? Or your brain or your head or whatever. Your brain is wired to this supercomputer, and the supercomputer sends to your brain exactly the same signal which you would have in the ordinary normal world situation. So, okay. Why don't we explain our perceptions by assuming we are brains in a vat? Well, you need an explanation, and if you think if you ask the question, how does the computer make it to generate exactly the same perception in our brain as we would have in the normal world with light rays and so on, then the obvious answer is, well, the supercomputer creates in itself an isomorphic copy of the realist explanation, this one. Of course, isomorphic is not identical because it does it with numbers, with digital representations. So the brain in the wet explanation assumes an isomorphic copy of the ordinary realist explanation and makes additional assumptions that we are wired to this supercomputer and so on. And therefore, the prior probability of the brain in the wet explanation must be smaller than that of the perceptual realism, and therefore it is to be preferred, right? So this is the solution. This shows that the perceptual realism is really the better explanation. And more generally, you can apply a similar argument to many other examples showing that an explanation is really the only plausible one because all other explanations are somehow artificial, are parasitic on your given explanation, in the far they assume somehow an isomorphic copy of the given explanation, but add a lot of additional assumptions to it. Okay, good. Now, so far, this was my first example. There is now a further problem, namely a possible criticism. You can say that the criteria of unificatory explanation and novel predictions are merely instrumentalistic. This means that you could also say, well, the assumption of an external world with three-dimensional objects is an instrumentalistic explanation. It makes it possible to predict our visual perceptions. But it doesn't necessarily force us to assume that this abducted common cause really exists, right? So what entitles us to assume the existence of the abducted common cause? Why shouldn't we better confine ourselves to the instrumentalistic position and say, well, these theoretical hypotheses are just good instruments to predict our observations, but not more? Well, and this is, of course, this old debated question of theory. Now, there is an interesting proposal. Theory generating abduction is justifiable if you assume a very weak causality principle. And if you look on the history of philosophy, this was the usual way how the abduction at that time was, for instance, called the principle of sufficient reason. I mean, that's not the same. But, people always assumed such a principle of sufficient cause or sufficient reason. I mean, I don't assume any kind of sufficient causality here or deterministic causality, but there's a similarity. So theory generating abduction can be justified by the following weak causal principle. If two properties or events are probabilistically dependent or correlated, then either one of them is the cause of the other, or both of them must be the effects of a common cause, or of several common causes, also possible. This principle is implied by the so-called Markov condition of causality, but it is weaker than that. And note that, yeah, and in this condition also, cause is not, is only meant as in the sense of a causal factor, not the full sufficient cause, the conjunction of all causal factors, just one causal factor, and the cause-effect relation may also be probabilistic. Okay. And here, the major argument is the following for this justification, namely, of abduction, of creative abduction. Namely, correlated disposition cannot be causes of other dispositions because they have independently realizable trigger conditions. If dispositions, empirical dispositions or regularities are correlated, then there must be effects of a theoretical common cause. This is the argument. And here's the explanation. So assume one disposition or empirical regularity like solubility in water and another disposition like non-solubility in oil, or maybe electric conductivity, or whatever. And what should it mean that T1 causes T2? If T1 and T2 are themselves implications, correlation, regularities, sorry. So here, look. So here we have these two dispositions. T1 means that whenever a trigger condition A1 is imposed, reaction R1 follows. So put it in water, it dissolves. A2 means whenever something like it is given in oil, it won't dissolve. Or whenever you put an electric voltage on the substance, it will conduct electricity, whatever. So what should it mean that this one is cause of this one? In some sense, it could only mean the following. All right. So if A2 is given, then A1 will be given. Then by this R1 will be given. Therefore, R2 will be given. So you need such a causal circle. This explains that. So this is derived regularity derived from that, and this. But this is impossible because the two and the sitting conditions are independent. So there you can independently realize A1 and A2. You give it in the water, you give it in oil, you put voltage on it. They cannot be causes from each other. Like this error cannot be. And therefore, this explanation that one disposition causes the other is not possible. Therefore, the only explanation of correlated dispositions is the existence of a common cause. So the cause, so there's a common cause C, which is both one part of the cause of the disposition, of the manifestation of disposition 1, is solution in water, and of disposition 2, for instance, electric conductivity or whatever you have. So this is this causal structure. Okay. And therefore, by this argument, the metaphysical principle of causality really gives us a deductive justification of theory generating abduction. So this is the second one. Okay. So we have now in common cause abduction, we have unification and independent stability as demarcation criteria for scientific and for reasonable common cause abduction. Then we have a metaphysical example of common cause abduction, perceptual realism. Then we have a weak causality principle gives a deductive justification of theory generating abduction. Now the next question is, well, but how can we justify the principle of causality? And this brings me to the second example, namely of an inductive metaphysics example of metaphysical abduction, namely how causality can be justified by abduction. But in this case, of course, by non-causal abduction. We can have an abductive justification of causality, but on pain of avoiding circularity, this justification must be now non-causal, solely based on unification and predictive power, because otherwise we would have a circle. We cannot assume causality in order to justify causality. This is clear. Okay. Now, I had written a paper and some follow-up papers together with my colleague Alexander Gebhardt, who is now in Turin. And there we argue that directed cause-effect relations are justified because they offer the best available explanation of two instability properties of correlation. Now, these are screening off, this is a well-known thing, going back to Reichenbach, and linking up, which is less known, but also not invented by us, right? The term comes from us. Okay. Explaining screening off. Now, what is screening off means the following. You have two variables, x and y. They are probabilistically dependent. This means if you change the values of x, the values of y will also change. But they are screened off by a third variable, z, which means if you fix the values of z to particular values, then the dependency disappears. So you say conditionally on Z, X and Y become independent. So they are unconditionally dependent. This is screening off. And here are two examples. For instance, the reading of a barometer and the coming of a storm are correlated. If the barometer falls, the storm is coming. But of course, we know the reason is the atmospheric pressure. So I mean, but we should free our mind now from any fabricated causal assumption. But the point is, if we fix the values of the atmospheric pressure, then the correlation between the two disappears. So if the atmospheric pressure is fixed, and I have one barometer and two barometers showing different scale measures, different degrees, then there will be no correlation with the storm coming in. But just one of the two barometers, or maybe both barometers, will just be false, right? They will be they will not indicating the pressure correctly. Or male and the frequency of car accidents are correlated. Males have more frequently car accidents than female drivers. But if you fix the speed of the average speed of the driver's car driving, then this correlation breaks down, right? Because this is just a matter of fact. Now the point is, how can you explain this screening off? And the best available explanation of screening off seems to be maybe the only, that there exists a real relation between these variables X and Z and Y. But there exists no direct causal dependency between X and Y. The dependency between X and Y in the probabilistic sense, right, is merely an indirect consequence of these two direct dependencies. It is mediated by the variable Z, so in this way. So this means that if you change the values of X, this will change the values of Z, and therefore this will incur a change of the values of Y. But if you fix the values of Z, then a change of the values of X can no longer be propagated to Y. So therefore, this correlation will break down. So here is a picture. The dashed lines are indications of correlations or probabilistic dependencies, and the straight lines here, the solid lines, are indication of causal relation. So this is a way how a relation of causality explains screening off. Note that so far, and we call these relations which we postulate causal, but so far only undirected causal dependencies are sufficient for explaining screening off. Undirected causality would be sufficient. Direct causal dependencies are just are needed for explaining the second thing, namely linking up. And linking up is a property, an instability property of correlations which is just the opposite. Unconditionally, you have the two variables X and Y are dependent in the probabilistic sense, but they become, two variables are now independent in the probabilistic sense, but they become dependent if you conditionalize on a third variable Z. So here, X, for instance, is the position of the sun, and Y is the length of a tower. And these two variables are obviously uncorrelated. But if you know that the length of the shadow of the tower is very long, and you know that the length of the tower is very small, short, then you can infer that the position of the sun must be D. So conditionally on Z, X and Y become correlated. And again, you have a riddle. If you free your mind from fabricated causal intuitions, you have a riddle. Why is that so? And again, the best available explanation must be the variable Z must somehow mediate the probabilistic dependency between X and Y. But now we have the opposite probabilistic stability effects, so that cannot have the same explanation as before, right? So the only plausible explanation is now to say causal dependencies are directed. Changes of value distributions are, so you assume the causal effect relation has a direction, and the changes of the values of the variable are now propagated only along the causal arrow, but not contrary to the causal arrow. And it cannot then be shown that two combinations of direction can explain screening off, namely the structure of an intermediate cause, X causes Z causes Y, and the structure of a common cause, Z causes both X and Y, while linking up is explained by the remaining third possibility, which is Z is a common effect both of cause X and cause Y, so both X and Y causes. Okay. And in this paper, we show that this abduction offers a unified explanation and is potentially predictive. In particular, we show that if the causal Markov condition is enriched by additional assumptions, either faithfulness or intervention possibilities or temporal forward directedness, one of these assumptions is already sufficient, such that the theory of causality achieves empirical content, right? To make the theory of causality empirical contentful. Okay. Now, and this finishes now my second example of a successful creative abduction in inductive metaphysics, namely the justification of causality as the best explanation of screening off and linking up, which is both unificatory and potentially predictive. And I'm almost finished. Just mention at the end. Of course, you may also say, well, yeah, you have justified now perceptual realism by common cause abduction. You have justified common cause abduction by causality, weak causality. You have justified causality by non-causal abduction. And so it would be interesting to know, is there a possibility of justifying creative abduction or theory generating abduction independently from causality? This is more a question from epistemology, but yes, I think yes, a justification is possible based on the optimality, on the epistemology of optimality justifications. And this is just in detail work out in my new book, which is entitled Optimality Justifications, New Foundations for Epistemology. You find it there. This is the book, which appeared in 2024. And this ends now my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, now questions, comments. Well, I will misuse my position and start the discussion. Well, Gerhard, in my opinion, the last part of your talk, you are trying to justify this realism about external world. And then I think it was point number 7, that there is a danger or objection of instrumentalism.
Yes.
You are taking that objection too seriously. And then you are trying to answer that. I mean, the danger of instrumentalism, you can be instrumentalist about anything. So instrumentalism is always a possibility. So it seems to me, maybe at the first glance, that there is really no need to go through all these arguments and trying to justify inference to the best explanation about the external world in order to defend your position against the possible objection of instrumentalism. Instrumentalism is just general thing. Can be instrumental.
Should I say something to it, or?
Hmm?
Do you
So-
want an answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
My
Well,
that you are taking this objection too serious.
yeah, I see. But I generally, where is it?
You're wiping your.
Yeah. Generally, I don't think so much so well about arguments like don't take this serious. I mean, my philosophy is an open-minded philosophy, so I'm open to all kinds of worldviews, and I'm coming more from epistemology than from metaphysics. Also metaphysics, of course, but the background is always epistemology, and so you have to be open to all kinds of views, and there is a strong philosophical group who thinks that instrumentalism is the right philosophy. This was the whole philosophy of all positivists and neo-positivists in their whole past. So just saying, don't take it serious, this is not my philosophy. The philosophy of so-called common sensism of Thomas Wright had this view. They said, well, usually in common sense, we think naive realism is given, and therefore let's just laugh about this instrumentalist or positivist position. So I don't laugh about it. If you think about young philosophers, which are not necessarily, so to speak, in the analytic metaphysics camp, but if you think about constructivism or all of these philosophies, they are everywhere there. You will find, so to speak, instrumentalist positions saying, well, all this is constructed, right? It's just a way to see the reality. So, and just understand me. Even all this, I really don't say that this shouldn't be taken serious. And therefore, I'm looking for arguments by which I can refute in a way, bring good counter arguments against these instrumentalistic positions. And also, if you say, I don't need to go through these arguments, what do you mean? I mean, isn't it an independent achievement if you find new arguments? I mean, every argument makes a position. Even if you already agree to a position, if you find a new argument for a position, it's a progress, no? You could say, well, you don't need the argument. But I mean, everything is disputed in philosophy. And here I show you some new arguments, or did you already knew them? Because you say, oh, that is not needed. Maybe you think it is boring, but I mean, I think these are really new arguments in the literature that they show that even what these old philosophers always said, that you need somehow an idea of causality in order to justify the inference from the effect to the cause, right? You need such a principle. I mean, the old views of causality from Leibniz, whatever, we think they are refuted by quantum physics and so on, and they are. But what is refuted is deterministic causality. But you see here in my argument that there's really a modernized version of that, namely that you can justify a common cause abduction or a form of abduction by a weak principle of causality. Well, and so on and so on. And then the second thing, this, even if you say this is not needed, the question how you can justify causality is a totally important question. There's a whole dispute in philosophy of science between instrumentalists and realists is about whether you should assume causality in science or not. Russell say no. Others say yes. I mean, what is causality? Very serious philosophers doubt that there is something like a precise concept of causality. And what I try here is to give a justification of causality by abduction. Okay, so this I'm thinking.
Yes, still, I think the hypothesis is that there is physical object out there and that we can see it from different angles and that we are calculating angles, distances subconsciously, blah, blah, okay. And now somebody comes and says, well, but we can be instrumentalists about that. Now we have, one thing is to have a discussion with instrumentalists and try to show that realism is more plausible hypothesis than instrumentalism. That's one thing. Then number 8, and then somebody says, you're assuming causation. Yes, I do assume causation. But can you justify it? Seems to me that this is a different discussion.
Why? I don't think so. It's usually thought as a different discussion, but I'm connecting different fields or subfields of metaphysics here. I think it's not a different discussion. Why? So why do you think it's a different discussion?
One question is, what's better, to be realist or instrumentalist? And I would separate that from the question of, and what about causation? Can you justify the causation?
Yeah, but I won't. I wanted to show no. You cannot separate it. This hangs together because the inference to the reality is an abductive inference to a common cause. And the question, and what the empiricists deny is that abductive inferences are, so to speak, truthworthy or truth-conducive or rational. That is what the empiricists, all empiricists of the traditional thought have denied that. And then how do realists usually justify abduction? By appeal to causality. So these two things are connected. All right? That is at least that is the way I argue. Okay.
I mean, they are connected, but I think that in this discussion we should go step by step.
Yeah, I did it in steps.
Questions, comments?
Okay, so I have a question, if I may. If I understood correctly, conceptual analysis should play an important role within the methodology of inductive metaphysics due to its a priori character, right? But if you could please elaborate the details of how we would apply conceptual analysis in inductive metaphysics, because in your example about perceptual realism, it was at least not clear to me in which sense we are relying on a type of conceptual analysis.
Yes, in this case, there is not much conceptual analysis, I would say. Yeah, there's just, of course, but I mean, you always have to explicate your concepts. And it's just, this is in the first place because in every task of analytic philosophy, there will conceptual analysis be involved. This is just in the nature of analytic philosophy. So already for this reason. And you remember when I spoke about common cause abduction, when I spoke about correlated dispositions, for instance, right? Remember? I could also go back. Then there was already one point where really conceptual analysis is needed. And what is your notion of disposition? I don't know whether you know the literature, but there was a controversy about it. There was this standard view of dispositional properties versus categorical properties, right? Categorical properties like a molecular structure are always manifest, and dispositional properties like this solubility in water need to be triggered in order to be manifested, right? There's just potentiality somehow, right? So, and then Mumford, Bird, and some British philosophers came and said, no, for us, dispositions are also somehow categorical. And they referred to elementary particles where it is not really clear whether electric charge or something is really not also something categorical, or but I have. There can be good arguments against this view. Even there's a categorical basis. And then there was Quine who argued against the regularity account of dispositions because regularities cannot be extensionally defined and so on. There's a lot of controversy. Just an example. So. Very briefly in my talk, I mentioned the notion of disposition as a regularity, as a nomological regularity. And having this notion, you can then show, this is also conceptual. Well, wait a moment. You can show from the Markov condition. The Markov condition is no longer purely conceptual. It is an inductive metaphysics, right? It's justified by an abduction. But then you can show, if you have this notion of a disposition and the Markov condition, then it is impossible that if two dispositions are correlated, then they must have a common cause, because it's impossible that one is the cause of the other in some reasonable sense, right? This was a major argument. So you see here, I had an explication of the notion of disposition. I had an abductive justification of the causal Markov condition, which came later. From that, an argument, a deductive argument follows for the inference from two correlated dispositions to a hidden common cause. And I can give you many other examples. For instance, with another philosophers, I worked with Maria Zakatskaya, I worked on the notion of freedom. So there are so many concepts of freedom in the literature that the major thing first is to say what should we mean by freedom. So for instance, does freedom really mean absolute freedom, unconditional freedom from any kind of cause or deterministic cause, or what do you really mean by it, or do you mean conditional freedom in the sense if done it otherwise, right, and so on. So it is clear, but still, after you have explicated your concepts and so to speak, established a program, what is your thesis, then abduction comes in, right? But no good abduction without having a good concept explication first.
Yeah, thanks. This was really good. Thank you.
Good, thank you.
Okay, Mark.
Hi, sorry, I got to the talk really late. I really apologize. I had an unexpected kind of emergency meeting that I had to go to. I'm in a completely different time zone from you guys. So it's my work day right now. Anyway, so I missed most of the talk, but I was picking up on some of it. And then this discussion here got me really interested. So I think, well, it depends what you mean by conceptual analysis. One thing you might mean is just defining your words and telling your reader what they mean. But it seems like most of the time when we use conceptual analysis, we're talking about trying to figure out what the word really means. And like when in some of your examples you were talking that way. Like we have to first figure out how we should use the word freedom before we do anything else. And so if that's what we mean, the second thing, and I think that's usually what philosophers mean by conceptual analysis, then it seems to me that to do metaphysics or basically any kind of philosophy, we just never need to do conceptual analysis, because what you can always do instead is proliferate new words. So you can just be like, look, here are the 7 different things that people have meant by free will. Let's call them free will 1, free will 2, free will 3, up to free will 7. I don't give a crap which one's really free will. I just want to talk about, I want to argue that we have free will 2 and we don't have free will 3, and free will 4 is important for moral responsibility and free will 5 isn't. Like, why do we need to figure out what free will means? That's just going to be like determined by facts about what the word means in English or in German. Why does it matter? Why can't we just subscript and talk about the new terms with stipulated definitions? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, it makes sense. Look, concept explication, I understand it always in the sense of Carnap, of speaking of conceptual re-engineering or whatever. So, of course, there are some different possible meanings. But then one meaning is privileged in the following sense. First of all, it is more fruitful than the other by several arguments. And then second, it also has to be applicable to the empirical phenomena you want to explain by an abductive inference. For instance, in the case of dispositions, I argued, well, I need this regularity view of dispositions, this nomological regularity, because first of all, that is what is really manifested if dispositions or several dispositions of soluble substances are correlated, right? And second, there are independent arguments why this non-standard view of dispositions, where you have dispositions somehow categorical properties, does not really fit well to science, right? But anyhow, then I say, well, I prefer this notion of disposition. I can really apply this correlations of dispositions in this sense, then leads me to the thesis that I can, if you have two correlated dispositions, then by the causal Markov condition, it cannot be that one is the cause of the other. So they must have a common cause. And that is the basic argument for my justification of common cause abduction. That is how this interact, or in freedom. In freedom, we have also an abductive theory of freedom. So what are the essential properties of freedom? I mean, there are different notions. So is it unconditional freedom? Well, this is hard to say. If you have a deterministic worldview, then there cannot be unconditional freedom of actions. Is it conditional freedom in the sense that it could have been, so if conditions would have been differently, you could have acted otherwise? Well, that is somehow weak and unclear. But we say that there are the following important things of a free act. A free act is, an act can only be free if there's absence of external forces which force you, of external factors which force your action, and there's absence of internal factors like traumata or whatever which force your action. So action is free if so to speak, the outcome of your will. This we focus on. And then we say, if you just have this notion of freedom in this quite weak sense, and then what was freedom used in the human thinking? We say that, well, it was used as in law, as freedom and responsibility. So major uses of freedom were for this purpose, to distinguish, say, between an action where you can be made responsible. Therefore, in order to change your wrong behavior, we must really change your way of thinking, versus an action which was enforced on you. Then, in order to change your behavior, you need not change your way of thinking, but you must just free you from these external forces which determine your action. So, this is the way how, in this case, the conceptual analysis of freedom and the abduction is related. You find first a fruitful meaning among these possible meanings, and then you can show that this meaning occurs in the empirical phenomenon, and you can make a fruitful abduction with this meaning of freedom. And you cannot have a fruitful abduction of anything with such a strong notion of freedom, absence of any deterministic factors, right? So yeah.
Warren, can I ask one follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so, but I don't feel like you're answering my question. So let's just say we've got two notions of freedom. I call them freedom 1 and freedom 2. One's like a compatibilist notion, maybe, and one's a libertarian notion. And let's say, without doing any conceptual analysis, we establish that we are freedom 1, we are free 1, and we're not free 2. And we can do whatever abductions you want to do with freedom 1, but not freedom 2, or maybe vice versa. But we know all the facts about the abductions and what we possess and what's required for moral responsibility of freedom 1 and freedom 2. But we haven't at all tried to answer the question, which of them is real free will? So here's my two questions for you. Once I know all of that, we are free 1, we're not free 2, all this stuff, just using free 1 and free 2. First of all, what's to be gained by figuring out which of these is real free will? That's the one question. And my second question is, what even determines whether one of them's real free will? It's my view is the only thing that could determine that is folk usage. It could just be like a semantic question about what the word means in English. But so what do you think determines the answer, and what's to be gained by knowing it? If we have these two words, free 1 and free 2, what's to be gained by figuring out which of them is like real freedom?
Yeah. Let me try to make me short, to be short. First, there is not the real meaning. I don't believe that. I'm not a semantic Platonist. There are more or less fruitful meanings, and these differences in fruitfulness of meanings can be huge. And I choose the most fruitful meaning. Second, if you have all this knowledge about the two notions of freedom and all abductive facts and so on, then the argument would be, well, the one notion of freedom was much more useful in the history of ideas or practices, social practices of mankind than the other. Because the use of freedom is, for instance, if someone did a wrong thing in court or in court decisions or moral decisions, it is decisive to know, was this act free or not in this sense? Because if it was determined by external or internal forces, you don't need to change the mind of the person. You have to do the forces away. So it's a kind of excuse or a kind of a different treatment. For instance, if the person is attracted to internal force in that case, then you treat it differently, then it was a free decision of the person. So this notion of freedom was a real important one in the history of social practices, while the other strong philosophical notion of freedom in the sense of free will or completely free will has never been used in social practice. And this is the argument.
It could be super useful to make the point that we lack certain kinds of freedom that we wished we had.
That is not
what I'm saying is what's fruitful for one person is not fruitful for another. So the person that wants to their goal is to point out the kinds of freedom we lack. Freedom one is going to be very useful for them to go, here's the one we wanted that we don't have.
Well, but you got my point, right? Now we can speak about possible goals. I mean, this is really epistemological pragmatics. You escape the circularity of this writing by referring to epistemic or other goals. But you see the point. Now we could go on discussing. I agree to you. For certain goals, it might be really enlightening to see that freedom in this strong sense cannot be achieved or whatever. Or if it would be achievable, you would be something like a god or something, right? Some non-natural powers or something, right? Could be interesting. But at least I can say that given this and this epistemic goals, this notion is to be preferred, and by abduction, then this and this can be inferred. I mean, and I don't say that this is the only right notion or that is the only right notion. I don't want to do that, right?
Yeah, I think I have a counterexample.
Okay.
Take, for instance, this notion of free will as unconditioned free will, uncaused cause of something. Wow.
Yes.
And it seems that in 2000 years of human history, that this notion was put forward by Christianity and so on, so that courts were operating with that notion for 2000 years. And they were successfully operating, saying whether somebody is guilty or not guilty or so on. But that concept of free will is hopelessly wrong. But nevertheless, you can use it in jurisprudence practice.
But the concept which was really working here was the concept of free action in the sense of absence of external or internal forces. Whether there is an uncaused cause or whether this person, right, thought in that way because already the father of this person thought in that way, right? The person is a burglar because already the father was a burglar, because already the grandfather was a burglar. I mean, that would mean that the will of this person was caused in some way by education. But that was never in the history reason for excusing this person. It was always the absence of forces, or external forces or internal forces. And this notion of uncaused cause was always the invention of philosophy. I mean, this was an ideological formulation, but it was not what was really working in society, I would say.
But we can imagine.
And the Enlightenment philosophers they didn't believe in this principle of uncaused cause. If you think about Holbach, how they explain then how a just society should work, you know, there were so many different philosophies. But what was effective in society, I would say, was the absence of external and internal forces.
But no, assume that we take this unconditioned cause as a meaning of free, and we can do the trial from the beginning to the end with that assumption.
I don't think so. Many people did not believe in it. I mean,
if somebody is caused by his father, grandfather, blah, blah,
yeah,
then he was not free. Because by free, we mean absolutely unconditional.
Yeah, but no one would in social practice, no one has ever argued that way. I mean, no court would argue that the son's burglary activity is not subject to punishment because the father was already a burglar. No one would ever argue it, because that was just the son acted on his will by doing this burglary, even if the father was a burglar, even if the will of the son was caused by the education. But that was not relevant. Relevant is the absence of forces, not this stronger philosophical notion.
We have a question similar to Marx. Question. We have a couple of notions of freedom, free will, or a couple of notions of causation. How abduction helps to pick up, to choose which one is good, which one is bad? How do they work?
I just lost you.
Huh?
I lost you now for some seconds, but now I have you again. I have you now again.
Sorry, I didn't get it.
So do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, because the internet was unstable for a moment.
Okay, we have a couple of notions of free will.
Yes.
Well, possibility of choice, absence of obstacles, self-control, blah, blah. How abduction helps here in analysis in any way?
I try to explain it by showing that certain notions can better explain why the notion of freedom is so important in social practice. I mean, you know, you need to have a notion of free action versus not free action in order to, in all societies, these notions obtain. In all civilized societies where you have a certain instilled system of law, you need to have this notion whether was the action free or not. And that notion of freedom, which can best explain why this is so important, has been so important in all society, in different cultures. This notion, which can best explain this, is to be preferred, is the abductively best explanation. This is in the case of freedom.
But
I mean, you know, I didn't choose the example of freedom because I admit that freedom is a more intricate example. I choose the example of perceptual realism, which you probably find a little bit simple, yeah, and the example of causality, which is certainly more difficult, right? But these were my two examples of inductive metaphysics argumentation. But of course, let's talk about freedom, no problem. But I mean, I admit that this is a more difficult thing, and I'm also not so much an expert on this.
Okay, but is that an abductive inference?
Yeah. You want to explain the fact that the notion of freedom is found in all different cultures, and therefore it was highly important in all kinds of cultures and social and societies. That is the fact which you want to explain. And the best explanation is that explanation which gives just that, it's just that essence of freedom which explains this. And the notion of freedom as an uncaused cause, yeah, is not needed to explain it. And also is not compatible with several societies where no one assumed an uncaused cause, right? That would be the idea.
Mark.
Sorry to keep pressing on this. So I agree, we need a notion of freedom in our culture. It's totally unclear that we need one notion of freedom in our culture and need to pick one. And it's also unclear that the notion that explains, like what explains why we need the notion in a court of law might not explain why people have existential angst about whether they have free will. Those are two different things that need explaining. Why should we think one notion does both, and why should we want to have one notion? Why? So I agree we need a notion, but why? What's the problem with a pluralistic? Just the more the merrier on concepts.
I didn't say that there's a problem with the pluralistic view. Also, I just said before that this is not the example which I have chosen because I'm not so much an expert in this field. I mean, and I also admitted that this is a more complicated question, domain with freedom.
But
I just gave you the basic idea of how an abductive account to freedom proceeds. And that is my main message. And that proceeds as follows. I repeat. So the fact to be explained is why freedom is so important in all kinds of societies, different of the social structure and of the culture. And that notion of freedom, explain this in the best way, is to be preferred. This is an abductive thing. Of course, if you want to have a pluralistic notion of freedom and arrive at this with abduction, you need to have different phenomena which have to be explained, right? So you would have to really differentiate at the level of the explanander, explain this, explain that. And for that, this notion of freedom is the best explanation for the other thing. The other notion of freedom is the best explanation. That would of course also be possible. Maybe you're right. I can't immediately rule that out now. Although I'm skeptical, but that would be possible, and that would be not any argument against the abductive methodology of inductive metaphysics, which was my major point. So then you would really say that certain explanations are better explanation of this social behavior, like behavior, how to punish or how to diagnose misbehavior, right, in societies. And the other things would be better explanations of, say, I don't know what you mean, the social angst, what is that? I mean, would have give me exactly the phenomena which, in your opinion, can only be explained by the stronger notion of free will in the sense of free will or uncaused cause of action. Give me the phenomena, and I give you the abduction. Yeah, if you can show me the phenomena, I could tell you if I agree.
Well, so we are talking about free will and abduction. So I expected different kind of argumentation. I expected that will explain somebody's behavior by appeal to this or that kind of free will, something causal in somebody's behavior. But it turned out that it's the ultimate judge is social practice and social needs. I mean, that's certainly good and true and healthy, but I expected something else, some kind of causal explanation of somebody's action.
What is the point now? Is this still something about free will now? Or?
Yes, still. So what are we looking for? What is the choice or preference of society? Or what is the cause of an individual's behavior?
No, I don't know. I mean,
no, what is abduction?
You must specify, for every abduction, you must specify the explanandum. I mean, you say, what is the best explanation of society? That is not any reasonable abductive question, because that is not a clear explanandum. What is a phenomenon which should be explained? Which
explanation
of society? That should be clear.
Well, one thing is, what is the best explanation of the choice of society to pick up this or that concept of freedom as relevant? That's one thing.
But you find this notion of freedom in all societies. That's my claim. The same notion of freedom you find in all societies, the notion of freedom in the sense of the absence. The action was free if internal or external forces were absent. You find very different philosophical notions of freedom. But in all society, you find this notion of freedom as operative. And therefore, that is needed. And the other things are just philosophical extensions that overstretch the range, the social function of freedom. This social function of freedom is just overstretched by these philosophical generalizations, right? That would be a possible hypothesis, but maybe this is wrong, could be. Maybe there are other facts in society where you can show that these other notions of freedom are needed. But so far I didn't find anyone. If common sense people speak about freedom, whether an action was free, whether this person is free, they mean that. The action was based on the person's free will. That's it.
Would this be the abductive inference? He did it because he was not able to control himself. He didn't have a capacity of self-control. Would that be an abductive inference?
No. That would be a particular inductive inference.
Yes?
Sure, of course, that would be an abductive inference, yeah. But in order for that reason, you need, of course, your notion of freedom. He did it because he was unfree. He was not able to control himself. Yeah, sure. For instance, he was drunk or whatever.
Yeah,
he was in extreme emotional state. Yeah. This would be a particular abduction. But the general abduction is why is this notion of freedom, where freedom means the ability to control,
so you would say,
is important. Why is this important?
So you would say that we have abduction at two levels. One is the choice of society, which concept of free will we will take as relevant. Another is on the individual level when we explain somebody's behavior. In both cases, we have abduction, although it's different.
I'm saying that in all societies, there was a similar notion of free will operative. I'm not saying that each different society has a different operative notion of free will. If that would of free action, if that would be the case, the theory would have to be different, of course. But I'm saying the opposite.
I think it was Mattia.
Yeah, just to pick up on this, but to use a different term. Let's use the term truth, right, or the concept of truth. Kevin Sharp argues, among other things, that the concept of truth is hopelessly inconsistent and deficient, right? And let's say we have a metaphysician who wants, or an epistemologist who wants to get at the, real nature, objective nature of truth, of the concept of truth. But if it turns out that the concept of truth as used in, I don't know, everyday discourse or language is really inconsistent and deficient, what is then, who should be the judge, or what should be the, I don't know, who should be the judge regarding the, real nature of truth? Should it be certain theoretical aims a particular researcher has in mind, a particular scientist, or something else?
Okay. Again, there's no real nature of truth. I mean, you always make the same assumption, which I don't make. There is no I'm not a semantic Platonist. There may be different notions of truth which are more or less fruitful. With each notion of truth, you can work. But with some notions of truth, you will stumble much more often than with others. And in particular, in the notion of truth case, I think it is absolutely fruitful to differentiate between descriptive truth or factual truth and a more general notion of truth, which includes normative or moral truth, right? because in the factual truth, you assume an objective world, and this you can arrive at with an abduction, right? As I told it, say perceptual realism. Let's stay in the domain of observations. And if you believe in that independent reality, at least in the perceptual, then you say truth is correspondence between belief and reality. That is just a correspondence theory of truth. So that is a very straightforward, broadly established notion, which you arrive by abduction and conceptual analysis, of course. Now, if you think about normative truth, what should that be? I saw different people, even today in philosophy, some more objectivists say, well, there's just truth simplicity. Although the same which holds for facts, whether the table is red or the ball is red or blue, is either true or false. The fact that this action was good or bad is just true or false. But what should that mean? That means just nothing. It's just common sense or whatever. So if you have moral truth, you must really, it's much more difficult. Do you mean there's an independent level of norms, so it's moral objectivism, or do you mean moral truths are intersubjective norms, there's intersubjectivity in morality, right? Or do you mean, and so on. There's always debate. Moral truth and normative truth is different from factual truth. That is, as a good empiricist, empirical minded philosopher, which I would tell every person from common sense or from non-philosophy, right? So you should distinguish that.
If I may continue Matthias' question, say I'm foundationalist about truth. Matthias is our correspondent. I believe in correspondence theory of truth. Matthias believes in coherence theory of truth. How can abduction help? How can inductive metaphysics help here?
By establishing perceptual realism. Because if there's an independent reality, and if that can be justified in a similar way from empirical phenomena as scientific hypothesis, then this is a strong argument for this minimal form of realism. And as soon as you have realism, you have a correspondent theory of truth. This is not enough for foundationalism. You need also tell a story about how your epistemic access to reality works. And that is where empiricism, in my view, comes in. So I don't believe in a Platonistic form of intuitionism, where your intuitions have immediate access to the reality. But I believe in empiricism or naturalism, where so information about this reality comes to you through your observation, through your senses. And if you have these two things, then you have a moderate form of foundationalism. Not in the sense that observations are infallible or something, but in the sense that justification structures are not circular, so to speak, not coherentistic, not purely coherentistic. They may involve some circles, but they are more or less rooted in a certain basis, and this basis is basis of perceptions and also basis of logical arguments, of course, for foundationalism. So if you have no argument for the assumption of an independent reality, then the whole epistemology of foundationalists becomes dubious, because where should it come from, your foundations? You must need, that is where this helps.
So we have this realism about the external world within the framework of abductive inference. Mm-hmm. And correspondence theory of truth fits better. Therefore, yes. Generally speaking, all our knowledge and so on more confirms correspondence theory of truth.
Yes, right. That would be
the line.
Good formulation of what I wanted to say. Yeah.
Boron, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
it's Mark. I'm gonna apologize again. I'm now driving to my office. I have another meeting to get to,
Okay.
so I'm on my phone and I'm not able to put my camera on. In any event, so I
Oops. Mark, the connection is lost.
Yeah.
Maybe there is. Mark, it doesn't work.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, go now.
Hello?
Yes.
Sorry, I think I drove through a dead zone. Okay, so I'm worried about just doing conceptual analysis at all
Okay.
and what it does. So I'm going to switch the example again to personhood and what it is to be the same person. So I don't know if you guys have seen this show, but there's this show on right now called Severance. And a lot of philosophers are talking about it online. And there are these characters in the show that have split personalities where when they're at work, they're one person in some kind of Lockean sense. And when they're out of work, they have a different set of memories and they don't remember anything that happens in the two places. And so all these philosophers online are arguing about whether the two people that inhabit the same body are the two they're trying to argue whether this is the same person. So like there's this character Helly. When she's on the inside, is she the same character as when she's or the same person as when she's on the outside? Okay, and like philosophers do, they're doing all this conceptual analysis and arguing about this. And here's the thing I want to say. Well, they're the same person sub one, and they're different people sub two, right? In a Lockean sense, they're clearly different people. They have different sets of memories, different consciousness. In some materialist sense, they're the same person. In the Lockean sense, they're different people. So here's what I'm saying. We've now said everything there is to say. They're the same materialist person. They're different Lockean people. What's to be gained by figuring out, well, are they really the same person? Let's do conceptual analysis on same person and figure out the answer to that question. And then we'll know if they're the same person. And the point I want to make is like, we already know all the facts. They're the same person in one sense and not the other sense. All right, yeah. That's it.
But I don't think that is the right picture because theory generating abduction is about unobservable structures and entities in nature which you don't know, and that's how I entangle conceptual analysis and abduction, because you want to arrive at concepts which refer, as Putnam said it, to the joints in the nature, right? Which we can observe, but we want to refer with our concepts to things in nature or processes in nature which are really, which are operative, which are important, which are not only refined to special domains. So, for instance, let's speak about physics. The notion of force is the force between the sun and the planets, and the force which binds me to which pulls me to the earth. Is this force the same force? Aristotle and the medieval people said no, that is a very different force. But Newton, they showed, well, no, it obeys the same laws all of the time. So of course we can define a notion of force one, which is confined to planets in the sun, and the notion of force two, which is about bodies on the earth and the center of the earth. But in fact, these two are instances of a common notion which we call gravitational force. And this notion of gravitational force is much more important because it refers to something deeper. Of course, we can have the other notions of force too, but there is a difference here. It's just not arbitrary. And also in the sense of the identity between persons. I mean, I don't know the details of your example, but I mean, identity in time is, of course, a subtle notion, but it is a totally important notion, identity in time. You know probably more than I about that.
I mean, I don't know that I do. Like, it's not like I'm an expert on personal identity. I just think, like, you can imagine, I mean, it's just like a split personality case, right? So
Yeah.
there's one physical body and there's two personalities that don't share memories.
Yeah.
And to me, the idea that, like, oh, we're going to figure out whether these two consciousnesses are the same person, and there's something to discover. It just seems wrong. There's nothing to discover. Here we know all the facts. It's two consciousnesses in one brain.
Yeah, it's I'm in intermediate position. It's I don't think that real meaning. You're right, but I also don't think that it is arbitrary, because some meanings can hit the joints of nature much more than others, and some meanings.
Oh yeah,
some meanings can.
For sure, I agree with that.
Than others. You agree with that? Good.
No, I totally agree. Some are more fruitful than others, but being fruitful in one, like, even if it's like the most fruitful, and it doesn't make it like, oh, that's what free will really is, or that's what same personhood really is. It's just like, oh, this one's more useful.
Yes. Okay.
But I agree. Some cut at the joints better than others. That's for sure true.
Good. So we have a large agreement then, and I would agree that we shouldn't. The reason that one notion is more fruitful doesn't mean that we should forget the other notion. It could turn out that it is fruitful for some other purpose.
Okay.
I agree.
All right.
With
thank
that.
you.
Yeah.
In this case, split personality, that abduction works. We are interviewing the guy and try to find out whether he is one personality or two.
Yeah.
So it seems that abduction works here. Well, we are making hypotheses whether he's two people, 3, 4, 5, or single person. Or actually, I think that psychiatrists, that's what they do. They have hypotheses of how many personalities there are in one
I
body.
don't know. Maybe you have asked this question to, what was the name, Berlinguer or so on. Maybe you should say something.
Mhm.
The person on the phone? No. Yeah.
I don't. I'm not sure. I don't have anything to say. But if you're asking me, I'm not sure.
Yeah. And I would agree in that case. You should, of course. I mean, there are different notions of identity between persons. If you're a naturalist, then of course a personality, a mind is an emergent property of a brain, and the brain of this person is at least the same, right? I mean, many structures of the brain have remained the same. There's just no memory. So the memory is a particular property of the brain, right? Of certain neurons in the brain, and with certain RNA chemicals which are in the I think it's the plasma of the neurons, of the neuronal cells. This is one explanation of memories, and they sometimes somehow have to be lost if you lose your memories. So there's of course then a story about where does the identity of a person end, and there are of course different criteria possible. That's how I would deal with this example.
Philip.
Hello. Thanks for the talk, first of all. Well, I'm just wondering whether the examples that we used right now in the discussion, free will, personal identity, are really good examples to put your case forward, because these notions are usually interest-driven by our ideas of what we want with, I don't know, free will or personal identity or whatever. So it seems that perhaps if you use some other examples from science, perhaps it would be a better way to put your argumentation forward. Because when dealing with stuff like free will, I think there are too many points in there. So it just doesn't serve your purpose very well. That's a feeling that I got through the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I didn't choose this example. I emphasize that it was not my example, and that is very difficult. I don't know whether you heard when I said it, that some 20 minutes before that. This is not bad. But these people were so interested, I just continue the discussion. I can discuss about everything, yeah. But of course, it's more difficult in that case. I fully agree. But I give you another example from the domain of causality. For instance, there's now, I also published a later paper on that, there's this debate in causality whether common causes always screen off completely the effects from each other. And there are certain cases, I mean, Nancy Cartwright said that they don't, and that would be then a violation of the Markov condition. I have written something about a weakening of the Markov condition where it's not necessary that common causes always screen off their effects completely from each other. Also in quantum mechanics, of course, that happens, but also in classical decays, where you have symmetry principles which correlate the effects, the parts of after the decay. And so, and then we here have a similar example, because I think whether you insist that common causes must screen off the effects from each other, and otherwise it's not really a case of causality, but it's a different principle. For instance, my colleague Alexander Gebhardt argued that now if these cases you have some certain non-causal correlations, right? Or whether a causality should be extended to include these non-causal correlations, these symmetry correlations between two joint effects, right? For instance, this debate, it seems to be somehow not clear, but there's a kind of, which concept of causality is more fruitful? So this would be an example where you have it in the domain of causality. Like in the case of freedom, but what is the more fruitful notion of freedom? Yeah, because we wanted such an example. And this is important because, you know, some philosophers and also physicists, theoretical physicists, argue that causality is violated in quantum physics. And others say, no, there is a generalized notion of causality which also operates in quantum physics.
Sorry, is there a tension between fruitfulness and cutting nature at its joints? Because sometimes, at least in the free will debate, we often want some kind of freedom that perhaps we do not have. And so therefore, this, if you apply the free will discussion to your example, it will generate problems because of fruitfulness. But if we put aside fruitfulness and instead try to put it closer to the idea of cutting nature at the joints and have like fruitfulness somehow embed in that, then perhaps the results will be different. Examples like the free will debate will be excluded. I don't know if I've been clear, but that
makes totally sense. The notion of fruitfulness is relative to assumed goals, which are usually epistemic goals. And I think that cutting nature at its joints is equivalent with fruitfulness with respect to explanatory power and predictive power or something. And maybe, yeah, because also explanatory virtues include also most simple explanation, most strong explanations, and of course use novel explanations. So if you have only this in mind, then fruitfulness guides you very close to cutting nature at its joint, I think. But if fruitfulness is related to various different purposes, like usefulness in society or so on, then of course it can lead to very different results depending on what kinds of goals you plug in there, right? Yeah, so it makes total sense.
Okay, so we are already for 2 hours, although hour and a half was it intended. So are there any more questions or comments? Well, I wonder, what about these metaphysical crazy entities like thisness, hexiety, substance, bundle theory of things, universals? Can inductive metaphysics help about these entities or alleged entities? Do they really exist or not?
This is a very good question, and lots of this is work for the future. I hope so, but it is not so clear. I mean, what is always clear is that these theories are unificatory. For instance, the trope theory, the trope theory connected with the bundle theory is, I think, really a good unification of the notion of elementary forces, elementary particles in physics, and these things you can apply it quite well. You can even explain the similarity between identical tropes and then type equivalences. So I think trope theory can unify a lot, but whether this can ever be potentially predictive, I don't know. I really don't know. Similar with the notion of an essence. And I mean, also the notion of an essence, I think it makes really good sense in physics and in chemistry, like the essence of an atom, right? Of an element. So it's an ordinary number, and then you have the number of Ordnungszahl and mass number and ordinary number or order number of an element, right? They totally, completely characterize the element. And they make up the essence. You can derive all properties of the shells from these two features. These are really the essence, or the essence of an elementary particle. Like the electron is given by elementary mass, elementary charge, I mean, these four elementary qualities. So in these domains, the notion of an essence, which is given by few elementary properties and determine all the nature of this particle, makes absolute sense. So this is metaphysics of essences is a good unification of these domains. But if you apply to biological species, it's well known that these species are historical entities. That to speak of essences in this sense is not really well applicable, right? Because they're evolutionary changing.
Well, one more question.
So in that sense, it is interesting that these metaphysical notions unify certain domains, but in other domains, it's not so well applicable. Okay, but please speak.
In abductive inference in perception of the external world, explanation is causal. Is always in metaphysics explanation causal? Or we have non-causal explanation?
No, it cannot be. For instance, if you explain, the abductive justification of causality itself must be non-causal. So even if in my narrow view, I must admit certain non-causal abductions, and in a certain sense, causality is the best explanation of this. I said it, causality is the best explanation of screening off and linking up as phenomena of correlations, which either disappear when you conditionalize the probability distribution, or they arise when you conditionalize the distribution, right? So even in this domain, you find non-causal explanations. And other philosophers of science have argued, for instance, that symmetry explanations, that one configuration cannot be the case because of symmetry, because of symmetry principles, which are, not causal in the temporal sense. This would also be examples of non-causal explanations. But then other philosophers went so far, like Williamson, to argue that you can even have explanations in logic or in mathematics. And then there's now a group of philosophers of logic which call themselves logical abductivists. They were part of our research group on inductive metaphysics, and they apply the abductive philosophy to logic. For instance, Williamson argued that by abductive inferences, classical logic is to be preferred. But on the other hand, Graham Priest argues that power-consistent logic is to be preferred by abductive inferences. So you see, obviously they have different kinds of criteria here for what is a better explanation in logic or so.
Yeah.
Of course, it's doubtful whether you should really stretch the notion of explanation and deduction so far that you apply it also to the domain of logic, but people have done it.
Yeah. Williamson apologized for this session. He has teachings. He is part of the book also.
Who, Williamson?
Yeah.
Oh, is he now in Rijeka or somewhere?
Oh, he's at home in.
Oh, okay. I see. Good.
He joins
Oh,
us.
good. Yeah.
This Zoom. Internet. Yeah, he has this.
Yeah.
Induction.
Yeah, he has this abductive philosophy, so I like this very much. Yeah.
He's pushing that thesis also.
Yeah.
This is sincerely, I'm more inclined to your writing. It's more causal, scientific, direct, straight. Williamson has maybe more vague concept of abduction in logic, although that's also acceptable, or in epistemology, or in ethics, or something.
Yeah.
Okay. No. Okay. So, I don't want to bother you anymore. Thank
It's
you.
already late, yeah.
Okay, so we can close. Gerhard, thank you very much for your lecture and for your time and energy.
Yes, thank you for your invitation.
Okay, so we will close this.
So let's